Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Sons of Thunder. This is Andrew and Chase, and today we have a video where we've been uh, prepared to make this video for a while. Chase has been working on a presentation. He's been putting this together, but he's been workshopping the argument for some time. And so this is going to be a bit of a continuation from our conversation a few months back on Calvinism, but more broadly about just the idea of determinism in general. And so Chase has today the rationality argument against determinism. So, Chase, without any further introduction, I will let you take over. I'll pull up and pull that up for you.
Sounds good. What up, everybody? What up? So yeah, like Andrew said, we're going to be going over the rationality argument against determinism. You have C.S. Lewis on the left, who famously used this argument, as well as Alvin Plantinga on the right. Let us... Okay. All right, hopefully. All right. So before we get into the argument itself, I'd just like to go ahead and define a few terms. So first of all, what is determinism? Well, determinism is the belief that all events, including human action and belief, are ultimately determined by causes external to the will. So essentially, this includes theistic determinism, which states that God ultimately determines all things, and atheistic or naturalistic determinism, which states that purely physical causes determine everything. So I'm not going after, well, I'm going after both, but not necessarily a specific one in this video. Just the idea of determinism in general, like Andrew said. You have John Calvin on the left here, and I believe this is, what's that guy's name? Not Spassky, but what is this guy's name? Spinoza. Spinoza on the right, an atheist who obviously famously argued for naturalistic determinism. So what is rationality? Well, rationality is the quality of basing your beliefs on decisions made through reasoning between logic and available evidence rather than through emotion or instinct. If we say that something is rational, what we mean is that it is logically coherent based on the evidence.
Right. So this is we're talking about someone who is able to, if all evidence is laid out accordingly, and they can sift through the evidence, then they can look at the evidence and they can come to a conclusion, right? And this is all happening in their mind, right? Like this is
yeah. So the idea that your belief can be defended with reason and logic and evidence rather than like emotion or instinct or desire or something like that.
I do think some people, without even knowing this is what they're arguing against, I have heard some people, the most anti-apologetics Christian crowd I actually deal with are like logically consistent Calvinists, who would argue that no amount of apologetics can change anyone's heart or understanding, and you can't be reasoned into the kingdom. It's all supernatural.
Right. Well, I mean, that is what Calvinism says. And well, we'll get into that here in a second. So what is the argument? Well, I'd like to just give you guys a simplified version very quickly, and then we'll go into the separate atheistic and theistic determinism camps here in a second. So a simplified version, if you're taking notes or if you just want to throw a question at a family member or something like that, would go something like this. Genuine rational belief requires that one forms their belief through seeking truth, justified in a normative standard of judgment that informs rationality toward what one ought to believe. Under determinism, beliefs are fully explained by prior sufficient causes. If a belief is fully explained by prior sufficient causes, then it is not held because of reasons in the required sense. Therefore, under determinism, no belief is rational, and therefore belief in determinism is self-defeating. Um, I think it's fairly simple. Some people might get caught up on what normative means. We'll go ahead and define that here in a minute, but essentially, normative is the quality of not just what is, but what ought to be. So we would say that like you should believe in, um, you know, you should believe that salt dissolves in water because it does. That is a should statement. That is a normative statement. Saying salt dissolves in water is just a non-normative statement. Um, so here's the simplified version against theistic determinism. Again, if you're just kind of taking notes and you want to throw something at somebody, um, it goes as follows: if God deterministically causes every belief, then human beliefs are not ultimately held because of reasons, but because of divine decree. Therefore, rational justification is undermined, including justification for theistic determinism itself. So, again, fairly simple. If God decreed that you have that belief, then you don't have that belief because it's rational. You have it because God determined you to have that belief. Um, and that's not, we're not trying to say here at the very outset, we're not trying to say that beliefs are made irrational by determinism. Like determinism could be true, and holding the belief in determinism would then be true. It just wouldn't be rationally justified because you just told it because you were determined to believe it. It could still very well be true. You know what I'm saying? Not determinism, right? That's the whole point of the argument. But a certain belief that you have, like, you know, salt dissolves in water, right? You can hold that belief in a deterministic system and it still be true, but that doesn't mean that it's rationally justified. And then here's a simplified version against naturalistic determinism. It goes something like the following: if naturalistic determinism is true, then our beliefs are entirely the result of non rational processes whose aim is not truth, but survival or physical necessity. Therefore, the connection between belief and truth is undermined. Therefore, we have a defeater for you trusting any belief, including naturalistic determinism itself. This is a very simplistic version of it. There's a much stronger kind of line of reasoning that we'll use later. But this is just something that if you were looking to um, begin to understand this argument, because this is kind of like the first time I heard it, I didn't really like it, didn't really click with me that well. So I wanted to put a couple of different simplified versions down. So that way, maybe if you're having a little bit of trouble understanding the argument, you can just come back here and see that this is the essence of the argument, and you can continue to build on it that way instead. So let's go ahead and define a few terms we talked about earlier in the slide that detailed just a general argument against determinism. We talked about a sufficient cause. Well, what is a sufficient cause? A sufficient cause is a cause that guarantees a specific outcome. For example, decapitation is a sufficient cause for death, but that doesn't mean that decapitation is the only cause for death. So, like, whenever we say that um, God's determinative decree uh, is the sufficient cause for your belief, that's what we mean. Like, it is the cause that guarantees your belief, whether or not you are, playing video games when you get decapitated, whether you're not, whatever you're doing before you're getting decapitated or while you're being decapitated, your decapitation is still going to cause you to die. So it's kind of the same way, like some determinists would like to argue, like, well, or theistic determinists in particular would say that, well, God determines according to reason. Well, the problem is that your reasoning is not the sufficient cause for your belief. Um, your reason is just kind of secondary to it, and it's not what determines your belief. God's decree is what determines your belief. And we'd like to go ahead and define the reasoning process as well. So, what is reasoning process? It is an individual's taking in of evidence using reason and logic to interpret the evidence and forming a conclusion based on that. For example, police officer sees fingerprints on the gun that fired the killing shot, interprets that to mean that the fingerprints would probably match the last person to fire the gun, and concludes that whoever those fingerprints belong to is the assailant. So that would be an example of the reasoning process, taking in evidence, mulling it over, and then forming your conclusion based on that. And here's this fun word, normative, which requires a little bit of nuance, especially in this argument. So, again, we talked about normative being what should be rather than what is. If I say that Andrew should be out taking care of his dog right now, that is a should be statement. That is what ought to be. That is what he should be doing. But if I say Andrew is instead here recording with me, that is just a non normative declarative statement about what Andrew is doing. Example, people should drive 70 miles per hour on the interstate. All right. So here's the big syllogism for the argument against theistic determinism. You guys should all be able to read that. And if you're listening, I will go ahead and explain it. I don't know that listening to this one will be the best, unfortunately, just because it's a lot of information and you'll probably have to pause and look at your screen for a while just to read it and to make sure you understand it, because this to me is a very powerful argument. So making sure that you get it correct is very obviously very important, but it makes things go a lot smoother, because if you present the argument wrong, then you're giving, the determinist a way out, and you don't want to do that. You want to be able to definitively defeat determinism. So let's go ahead and read through the syllogism real quick. So it says in premise 1, under theistic determinism, God is the ultimate sufficient cause of every human's reasoning process and every human belief. For a person to, premise 2 states, for a person to rationally believe a proposition, their believing it must be appropriately explained by their grasp of the reasons/evidence for it. Premise 3 says rational belief is essentially normative, i.e., a belief is rationally justified only if the believer holds it because they recognize that the available evidence gives them a normative reason to believe it, i.e., they take themselves to ought to believe it. I would really like to hammer this home, right? Normative. You should believe it. You should believe something if it's true. Andrew, should you believe something that is true?
Yes.
Okay. That is the point. You should believe something because it's true. Not that you just have a belief and that, your belief just is, and that's just what you believe. You should believe true things. So
yeah.
we will continue with that. That's very important for both the theistic and atheistic determinism.
Well, the other day we at the timing of this recording, this past week we had done a live stream with Adam Seeker on Islam, and we had a guy come in, and you tried to use his argument, and you proposed to him a very solid question of how, if Allah has written everything down 50,000 years ago, so everything is a divine decree, they're not, Islam might teach free will, but the Quran does not teach free will. How do we take that you and I are both claiming that we have reviewed all evidences and have come to our conclusions that Christianity is true or that Islam is true? If we can confidently say that we have rationally come to these decisions based on the searching and sifting of evidence, that can't be true if everything has been determined. In one sense, neither of us can be right, and then in another sense, only one of us can be right, obviously, right? And he kind of completely did not understand the argument.
Yeah. I don't think he understood it, and that was kind of a problem from the beginning because I wanted to talk to him, um, and I didn't think he would understand the problem, and then it kind of devolved, and then Adam kept interrupting, and he kept wanting to talk about what Adam was saying instead of the argument, and so I just kind of gave up because I was like, I'm not getting him to answer this. But I mean, eventually he did just admit that, well, you believe what you believe because the law determined you to believe it and because the law wants you to burn in hell. So, then that was, and he said he would be he said he'd be in Jenna laughing with the law or something like that. I thought is what he said, but
which, unfortunately, I know that most Calvinists are not like this. I'm not making that claim, but I have talked to literally hyper Calvinists who would come to that same conclusion, that God has given you reason and rationality to your specific point in his divine decree, because God has passed over you. Now, some would just flat out say God loves some and hates others, right? So God hates those that he did not choose to save. If he didn't write you into salvation, then it's because he hates you. He does not have love for you. And now, again, I'm not making a claim that all Calvinists believe that. I don't. It's not true. But hyper Calvinism does teach that ideology that it's okay to hate certain people because they are the ones that God hates, and that he passed over them for salvation. And so it doesn't matter if you hate them because they're going to hell anyways. And I think that where you got with him in that argument was honestly like a perfect representation of determinism to its logical conclusion, or theistic determinism to its logical conclusion, which is the only reason that God doesn't, if God didn't pick you, it means he doesn't like you, right? Like the argument's always, oh, we can't boast in our, if you had any ability to choose God, you get to boast in your salvation. Whereas if we didn't get to choose God and God chose us, we have nothing to boast about. But that's completely missing the ideology that you are God's special little noodle. You're God's little golden star that he taped up on the board and he threw the other stars away. How do you not get to boast in that? You were the special one.
With face of yellow.
Yeah. And when you specifically start telling people that they weren't chosen, but you were chosen, that's boasting. So claiming you don't boast, again, this is the logical conclusion of theistic determinism fully played out. And so if you haven't seen that video, go watch it. It was that conversation, I think, was very telling of where somebody will eventually get to if you press them on theistic determinism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's at the very least where more bold determinists will get to, because generally from my experience, more intelligent determinists will not scream fiery damnation at you.
Well, most determinists don't tend to live like they're determinists. That was, I had a conversation with, and he's an atheist, but I had a conversation with a young coworker who is a naturalistic determinist. And when I asked him about that, I said, do you live the way that you believe? And he said, no, absolutely not. He's like, if I lived the way I believe, then I think I'd turn into a nihilist. And he said, but I also believe that all of my reasoning and rationality and all of my reactions are determined. It's like, so I can't even, he's like, so even if something were to, like, let's say someone bullies him or hurts him in a way that causes him to have some type of, offended or sad reaction. My argument to him was, why do you feel that way? Because if it's been predetermined, why don't you just say, oh, well, this is just the way the universe wanted this to be? And then he responded with, well, he's like, even if I could rationalize that in my mind, my reactions themselves have been predetermined.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't choose how I would respond to a certain situation. it's already been chosen for me by natural causes. I'm just already going to react that way. And I was like, well, you know what? At least you're consistent. That's a very consistent worldview, even though if I think it's wrong, I can at least acknowledge someone's consistency.
Well, again, the problem is that, in my opinion, you can use the morality argument against naturalism, which is probably one of the strongest if you're talking to someone with a lick of sense. You can use like ontological argument. You can use arguments from science, but this one, in my opinion, gets to the heart of the issue because whenever your coworker said, "Well, all of these things are predetermined anyways," then all you would have to say is, "Well, do you think that atheism is true?" Because if you say yes, and sorry, not just true, but do you think it is rational? If that person were to say yes, then well, you can't, right? And then you can just go straight into this argument by saying that, well, you can't actually rationalize anything under determinism. And so I think showing someone that a belief, I I s- I s- I don't like to say that this makes belief in determinism irrational. I just like to say that you have to affirm it without reason. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
It's like, do I think that determinism is irrational? Yeah. I don't think this argument makes it irrational. It just makes it not rationally justified, you know?
yeah,
Um, so like when a calculator you put 2 plus 2 into a calculator and equals 2, you wouldn't say that that was necessarily rational, but it's also not false, so it's not irrational. So that's it. Kind of determinism just leads you into a state of being, like, where it just is. You can't really defend anything or do anything, or you know what I'm saying? Like
yeah.
nihilism kind of sets in at that point.
Yeah,
Um,
he did find the argument interesting when I proposed to him the only way I argued that because God exists, we can have free will. Um,
yeah, you can't have free will outside of God.
yeah, I argued that if there is no God, then I can understand his perspective, but because and then you can flow into the rationality argument. The fact
Hmm.
that we can use reason and logic to come to a conclusion proves that we have some type of inner ability to rationalize thought, and that has to come from some type of higher power. Because if everything was, again, I'm just restating what you've already said, but
Right, right.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, and generally, where the atheists will go is they'll, well, we'll get to that point in the notes, Andrew. Dang it! Why don't you
So sorry, so sorry.
derail everything? We're
I'm
talking
so
about
sorry. Go ahead and keep
we're
going.
not
Keep
even
going.
on premise 4 yet. Anyways,
Sorry. Get
so
you got it. You got it.
premise 4, premise 4 states: if God's determining decree is the sufficient explanation of the reasoning process and beliefs, then the person's grasp of reasons and normativity is not the ultimate explanatory ground of the belief. Premise 5. If the agent's understanding of reasons and normativity does no real explanatory work in producing the belief, then the agent does not genuinely believe on the basis of reasons. Premise 6. If no one ever believes on the basis of reasons, then no human belief is rationally justified. Premise 7. Theistic determinism is itself a human belief. Premise 8. Therefore, if theistic determinism is true, belief in theistic determinism is not rationally justified and therefore self-defeating.
Sorry for the interruption. Just a real quick message. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you for that. Go ahead and consider liking and subscribing, as these are free ways that you can help the channel grow. And as we continue to push forward to 1,000 subscribers, you all have made a huge impact for us. So thank you again for clicking on the video, and let's get back to the content.
So that's the argument, and we'll just go ahead and do a little breakdown here. So let's break down the syllogism. Premise 1: under theistic determinism, God is the ultimate sufficient cause of every human's reasoning process and every human belief. I would say that exhaustive divine determinism states that there's nothing that happens unless God wills for it to happen. So this video, this conversation that I'm having with Andrew, this slideshow, all of these things are God's will to happen because it happened. That's what an exhaustive divine determinist would say. I would believe that, generally speaking, many Muslims are proponents of exhaustive divine determinism, as well as Calvinists. Some are not, and they would take a little bit more of a less determined view. But I would argue that those don't solve the problem. So, like, some softer forms of Calvinism, or of Calvinism, of determinism, try to deny this. However, if we use Calvinism as an example, they believe that saving faith is given to a person through irresistible grace, and that belief in Jesus is rational based on the evidence. So, if you if you're a Calvinist, you have to believe in like unconditional election, which states that only people who were chosen before the foundation of the earth are saved, and will be saved. And it is by grace through faith that they are saved. So they were given saving faith, but also that faith is rational, right? They would say that it is rational to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and so put all that stuff together, and you get that God determined a person to believe something which is rational, and determined others to not believe something which is irrational. Islam is much easier, as it explicitly teaches exhaustive divine determinism. But again, some Muslims will try to deny that. If you'd like, you're more than welcome to check out these references I have here in Surah 4, verse 143, Surah 7, verse 30, and verse 179, and then Sahih Muslim 2662c. Those all fall under the category of teaching Islamic exhaustive divine determinism, or they call it fate qadar, the doctrine of qadar, which is determinism. So again, just to make sure that we understand, even if the Calvinist tries to deny this, you could say that, well, only those who were chosen are saved, and they're given saving faith, and but you'd say that faith is also rational. So that doesn't solve the problem for them. Premises 2 and 3 aren't really debated, but premises 4 and 5 are really hotly debated. So premise 4, we'll just go ahead and restate it. It says, if God's determining decree is the sufficient explanation of the reasoning process and belief, then the person's grasp of reasons is not the ultimate explanatory ground of the belief. If the agent's premise 5 says, if the agent's understanding of reasons does no real explanatory work in producing the belief, then the agent does not genuinely believe on the basis of reasons. There are two main responses to this argument. Objection response, if you will, number 1 is the compatibilist response. So the Calvinist, the Muslim, the whoever would say, just because God determines the entire process doesn't mean that the entire process is irrational. It just means that God determined the process, and logic it just means that God determined it. Reasons and logic are just part of the deterministic chain. Example, God can determine the reasoning process of the cop from the earlier example, and it still be rational. So remember, we talked about the cop who saw the gun, saw the fingerprints, assumed that the fingerprints would be from the last person that fired it, and then came to the conclusion that whoever those fingerprints belonged to would be the assailant. And they would say, well, God determined that whole thing, and that doesn't make it any less rational. In fact, I would come to the same conclusion, right? Even if, God determined it, the process is still rational, and everything is great. Well, this response may seem to answer the problem, but it actually, in my opinion, fails to give a satisfactory response to the normativity requirement in premise 3. So why someone ought to believe something. Now, why is that? Well, I'd say that virtually all theists can agree that objective normativity exists. That is, a person should believe something because it is true, and not because they find it personally compelling. So an atheist could be an atheist because they find it personally compelling, but they should be a theist because it's true, right? Whether or not they find the arguments for theism particularly compelling is of no concern. Uh, it's true, right? If Andrew wants to say, Chase, why the heck are you wearing a white shirt? I'd say, Andrew, I'm wearing a blue shirt. He'd say, no, I don't find that compelling. I think your camera's lying. I think you're wearing a white shirt, actually. I'd be like, well, Andrew, that's wrong because it's wrong. And that's why you should believe that I have a blue shirt on, not because you think the camera's lying. So, which this sets up the knockout punch, in my opinion. Why does a perfectly reasonable, truthful, rational, and loving God, man, I included an and in there when I shouldn't have. I was going to end it at rational, but then I threw in loving because I think that also plays a huge role. So why does a perfectly reasonable, truthful, rational, and loving God often determine people, including believers, to believe against objective normative reality, and oftentimes determine that they not believe in Jesus at all? So we would say that, right now there are almost, what is it, like 8.5 billion people on the face of the planet right now. And there has never been more unbelievers. There are more unbelievers than there are believers on the earth right now. And so that means that God determined that most people would not be saved or not believe at this moment, at the very least. And we know from the past that the majority of people have not been believers in Jesus and in Yahweh. And not just that, but you have believers like Andrew and I who were apparently determined to believe that determinism is false. God has determined for us to reason against objective normative reality. Um, why? Why would God do that? Because you said that a person should believe this thing. If a person should believe that thing, but God makes them not believe it, why would he do that? That's on him at that point. It's not on the person. The person had no say in their belief. Let's say that their belief is completely rational according to them. They think it's super rational. Atheists think atheism is irrational. But God determined all that. They determined what the atheist would find rational. They determined what the atheist would or he determined what the atheist would find convincing. So why would God do that? That's a much harder problem than I think you realize. But not just that. I also don't think that this gives a sufficient answer really to the reason thing, because then you have to ask, what does it mean that God determines according to rationality? Then rationality kind of becomes whatever God determined it to be for that person, and not an objective standard, right? So like, let's say a person finds atheism to be objectively normative because God determined that they find it objectively normative. And Andrew and I find theism to be objectively normative. So at that point, then it's just the person thinking that, and it has nothing to do with objective normativity. And so at that point, you really can't really even defend objective normativity in determinism, because you're like, well, what is the point? Like, what matters anyways?
That's a good point. There could be, yeah, it's kind of like in a deterministic sense, there could be objective truth, but you can't discover it, if that makes sense. Because you would only be able to truly understand subjective truth based on what God has already determined for you or what nature has already determined for you. And so when nature determined your belief systems, or when God determined your belief systems, even if there is objective truth, it could not be discoverable. However, as we've already said, some people would get objective truth. So that means on God's end, God would be playing extreme favoritism that some people are able to process objective truth that he's given them, because there is a truth. Obviously, truth has to exist. Truth does exist in some form, but through reason and rationality, truth can be discovered. But through determinism, truth cannot be discovered. You either know it or you do not know it. And that absolutely is favoritism on God's end to an extreme extent. It would also mean that nature plays some form of favoritism in its natural processes if you could even get to that point. That you'd have a harder time explaining how nature could even provide anyone with any form of objective truth. But that it wouldn't be about survival anymore. It would be about random chance that some people get to have objective knowledge while the rest get subjective knowledge, and then that plays major ramifications for just how society operates and how, so I think that's essentially impossible.
It also makes for an even more damning case whenever you ask this one question. Whenever you ask, so let's say that God does determine according to rationality what a person, he determines that person's rationality and determines their beliefs and stuff accordingly. How can anyone trust their rationality then?
Right.
Because there are 1.8 billion Muslims on the face of the planet. Their rationality is convincing them that Islam is true. There are however many Hindus and Taoists and Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, and their rationalities are all telling them that their belief system is true because God determined them to believe that. And so as a Calvinist or as a Muslim, how can you say that you can even trust your rationality? Because, I mean, maybe you're one of the chosen ones. I mean, according to Islam, Abu Bakr wouldn't even trust Allah if he had a foot in paradise. And according to, I think probably a majority of Calvinists would say this, but they hold the idea of prevenient grace, right? The idea that God gives saving grace to some people, but then would take it away.
That's not that's evanescent grace.
Evanescent. Sorry, prevenient grace different. That's Arminianism.
Yeah.
Evanescent grace is the idea that God gives saving grace to someone and then takes it away. Now, I don't think that all Calvinists affirm that, but God, at the very least, does mislead a lot of people. So, what makes you think that your position is any truer, and what gives you any right to say that your interpretation of the Scripture is any more correct than mine? Because, well, I was just as determined in my interpretation as you were. So how are you supposed to trust your thoughts anyways, what you find to be personally compelling anyways? Let us move on. And this is the second response, the normativity is independent of causation response. So the Calvinist or Muslim might say, well, a belief being determined does not make that belief irrational or unjustified. Example being a calculator was determined by prior physical states to come to the correct answer of the function that was plugged into it. However, the problem that we would have with this is that this is not the argument. Again, as we stated before, we have never said that determined beliefs are wrong because they were determined. We've only said that a person cannot claim that their belief is rationally justified. That's the point. We're not saying that under determinism everything is false. We're just saying that no matter how much That's the thing. No matter how much convincing you do to someone who was determined not to believe, they're not going to believe, you know? Um, and when I say determined, I don't mean that that person is determined like they've determined not to believe in it. I mean that they were determined by God not to believe said thing, um, i.e., the crucifixion or whatever. Before we get into the atheistic argument, I would like to define a single term, which is the term non-normative. We already touched on this a little bit earlier, but the term non-normative essentially means it is about what is, without regard for what should be. So earlier, our example was people should drive 70 miles per hour on the interstate, and that was a statement of normativity. But a statement that is non-normative would be something like people drive 70 miles per hour on the interstate. Just a simple observation, right? That's just what happened. Yeah, and normativity extends into plenty of things like moral normativity, what you should believe about morality or ethics or something like that. Like a and that's a whole different debate with especially an atheist and a theistic determinist too, because it brings into question God's character and what you can say truly is right or wrong, because God is the one who determines everything anyways, regardless. So here is the syllogism against naturalistic determinism. So it's got 2 less points. um, I think that the last point would have been 2 points. Yeah, I could have separated it into 2 points, but I didn't. Um, so the syllogism goes as follows. It says, rational belief formation involves normative relations to truth, i.e., a belief is justified only if one ought to accept it on the basis of logic, reasons, and evidence. Naturalistic determinism is true. Every belief is produced entirely by prior non-normative physical causes whose operation does not depend on whether the believed proposition is true or logically follows from the premises. Premise 3 says, if a belief is produced solely by causes whose operation does not depend on the truth of the proposition believed or how logically it follows, then those causes cannot provide a normative justification for that belief. Therefore, if naturalistic determinism is true, no belief is normatively justified by logic, reasons, or evidence. Premise 5, naturalistic determinism itself is presented as a belief that is rationally justified by logic, reasons, and evidence. And premise 6, therefore, if naturalistic determinism were true, belief in naturalistic determinism would lack rational justification, making the position self-defeating. This is a lot of words, and I can understand if you might take a second to just kind of read over it and just remember the definitions that we gave. So, normative relations to truth, right? Like you should believe something because it is true. Like I should believe that Andrew's wearing a hat. It's justified because I ought to believe it on the basis of logic and evidence, right? Um, I can see that he's wearing a hat on the video. I know that the video feed is coming from a camera that's placed in front of him. The camera placed in front of him is recording his face and his head, and the hat is placed very nicely onto the top of his dome. So that is that's how I would justify rationally this hat on Andrew's head.
Makes sense to me.
Exactly. Thank you.
I'm not your target audience, but it makes sense to me.
Yeah, exactly. Andrew's hat just proves naturalism. But yeah, just wear it like it's like whenever whenever Patrick and SpongeBob and Squidward are all stuck in that hole, and he tells him that he's claustrophobic, and he's like, "Oh, oh, oh." you just like go up to an atheist and like show him your hat.
Yeah, stop it! You're scaring him.
Stop it! You're scaring him. Anyways, let's continue. So let's break down the syllogism. We didn't do a exhaustive breakdown of the last syllogism because I just kind of wanted to skip to the arguments against it. I didn't really think that these points necessarily need explaining as much as they do just reading it and understanding what it says. Um, because that's kind of how I had to come to this. I just had to read it and understand what it says, and then be like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense." No amount of explaining that anyone did would have helped me understand this argument, unfortunately, because there were people who tried. There's my buddy. He brought this argument up before I even I'd heard it before, but I'd never thought about it all that much. And he explained it, and I was just like, "Oh yeah." And now I'm like, "Oh yeah," you know. So, but anyways, so premise one states rational belief formation involves normative relations to truth, i.e., belief is justified only if one ought to accept it on the basis of logic, reasons, and evidence. I'd say that most atheists believe that there's such thing as objective normativity, logic, or reason. If not, many conversations would quickly devolve due to subjectivity. So if you were talking to an atheist and they'd say, "Well, I don't believe that there is objective normativity." One cheeky question. What? And it's so dumb to me that this this question, but it gets to the heart of the issue. So if an atheist says, "Well, I don't believe in objective normativity," what would you ask, Andrew?
How do you know?
Hmm. That's not what you would ask, Andrew. You would say, "Is that objectively normative?"
Okay, better way of putting it. Yeah.
Huh.
Is your statement true?
Is your statement true?
How can we know your statement is true?
Yeah, because if there is no objective normativity, then why am I supposed to? Is that objectively normative? Should I believe that there is no objective anything? Because that's ultimately the atheist position. Because if an atheist is trying to convince you of atheism, then they have to use objective logic, reason, evidence, these standards in order to convince you of these things. Because if the whole thing was up to subjectivity, they could bring me 100 scientists who say yes, atheism is 100% true, abiogenesis and the Big Bang being caused by absolutely nothing. It's all absolutely true. All I would have to say is that, well, yeah, to you.
Which is the new ultimate form of rage bait, by the way. It's just to when someone gets done saying something to say, "Yeah, to you."
To you, right? Because again, I'm genuinely, and I've had conversations with atheists before talking about objective truth and normativity, that you should believe something because it's true. Like, you can't function without, I'm not crazy, right? You can't function without objective normative standards,
Oh, yeah.
right? Because the English alphabet, for example, let's say that the alphabet was all of a sudden subjective, and when I said rational belief, what I actually spelled was beefsteak, and you just didn't know because I changed what the letters mean. It's like you can't just say that. That says rational belief, not
Yeah.
beefsteak.
Well, in the
You
same
know?
way, we have a foundation that if nothing else, if you believe everything is up in the air on how truthful we can know anything to be, like how do I know that behind your presentation, the color of the streaks on our background are orange, pink, white, and yellow, and then navy on the ends? How can I know that to be true? It could just be subjective to the colors my eyes are perceiving. How can I know that, you know, as we're recording this, there's a timer telling me the exact time that it is that we've been recording for? Oh, well, how can I know that to be true? Maybe time is relative. It's like all this you just but the one thing that we can't escape from is that we have objective truths in math, right? There are specific things that have to be true. 2 plus 2 will always equal 4, right? You can't, there's no way around that is an objective truth statement.
Mhm.
and that's objectively true no matter where you are, right? If somebody wanted to make an argument, well, this word means this to you, but to other people this word has different connotations and different meanings. So how do you know that a word can mean whatever, and it changes over time because lexicons change, and so there's something concrete about language. Okay, numbers are concrete. You can plug, it does not matter how many times you plug 2 plus 2 into a calculator, it will give you 4 every single time. And unless the calculator breaks from you pressing the equals button too many times, and then you just don't get anything, but you're never going to get 5, right? So if we can establish that there is an objective standard, no matter what else, there is at least one objective truth and standard that exists, and that is in math, then we can start having that conversation about everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously some objective truth does exist. So that, if someone is telling, is going back and forth with you on whether or not we can know that there is truth, I would just go straight to math and say, or start with what Chase said. How can we know then that your statement is true? Because you're making a truth claim.
Mm-hmm.
The claim itself, we can't know truth, is a truth claim.
Mm-hmm.
How can we know that's true? And why should we trust your opinion versus what we have already stated? What evidence do you have to provide that we can't trust anything to be true? And then go into, okay, so how do we know that math is true? How do we know that we can trust math? If you're telling me we can't, then how do we have a basis for anything?
Mm-hmm.
So
you can actually use math to argue for God's existence as well. I don't know if you've ever heard the argument for math, but it's actually a pretty convincing argument to me. It states that, math is objectively true. Since the truths about math are all conceptual and numbers themselves are conceptual, then it transcends physicality.
it's more of a discovery than a creation. Like
Yeah.
we found it. It would exist if we weren't here.
Yeah, it would exist if nothing else did, which you cannot say the same thing for like matter and light and gravity. All of these things are contingent upon creation and it existing, but math just is. And so it is a concrete objective truth that has always and will always exist and be true, but not be physical. So it's very interesting. I've never actually fleshed out the argument to its fullest, but I know that you can use math to argue for God.
Maybe that's our next video. The argument from mathematics.
You can take that one over, Chief.
I was terrible at math.
I loved math so much. Algebra was my jam, but I couldn't.
I'm a geometry guy.
Just doing this video itself was crazy. We might have to do another TikTok reaction after this one.
Yeah, it's been long enough. We need to have a cool down.
We do need a cool down. Of course, this one's been a long time coming, anyways. Starving the viewers of content. Premises 2 and 3. This is really where the debate lies to me, so I just restate it. It says if naturalistic determinism is true, every belief is produced entirely by prior non-normative physical causes whose operation does not depend on whether the belief proposition are true or logically follows from the premises. Premise 3, if a belief is produced solely by causes whose operation does not depend on the truth of the proposition believed or how logically it follows, then those causes cannot provide a normative justification for that belief. And then these premises are where the debate lies, and I found the 3 most common naturalistic objections to them. So, Andrew, if I were to take a Texas Industries scientific calculator and I plugged in 1 + 1 and it gave me 4, could the calculator rationally justify its answer to me?
Maybe with an error code. I don't no.
No. So the calculator itself is not a rational agent. The calculator itself does no thinking. It is completely and wholly determined based on prior physical states. Like prior to the answer 2 coming out, I pressed 1 and then plus and then 1, and all of those physical states led to electrical signals that got sent to, the calculators. Is it called a motherboard? No, what is it called? It's like a technology thing, and
Yeah, yeah,
it just bloobity blobbity bloop 2, right?
like a circuit board. There you go.
Right, something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
And it pops out 2, and it's great, and I love that. But it's not rational that it did that. It just did that because that's how it was designed to do it. It wasn't necessarily rational. It didn't come to a conclusion. It just said 2. So does that make 1 plus 1 equals 2 any less true, Andrew?
No, because
No.
you could line up 50 calculators and put the same equation in all of them, and if one or two of them gave you a different outcome, what you would rationalize is that they're broken,
Right.
that they have some type of defect and should not be used.
The first argument is just straight up a denial of premise 3. So premise 3
No,
being
sorry. I just think it's funny now to laugh and think, no, actually, what we should do is think about what they've placed and question if maybe they have a point. Like like the calculators can provide rational
yes,
arguments.
some sort
Like
of
they're
argument.
it's really a philosophical issue.
Right.
They're 1 plus 1 equals 4? Like the question mark. They're like, I don't know. That's me to laugh.
Yes, the calculator begins to speak. What does a man do then? What does a man do when the calculator begins to speak? Have you
We're getting there.
there's a JonTron episode where I don't know if you ever watched JonTron, Andrew,
Way
but
way
he
back in the day, yeah.
dude, there I don't know if you ever saw the Skateboard Kid episode.
I don't think so.
It's a movie called The Skateboard Kid, and in the movie, he he's like he gets his this kid gets his skateboard broken, and so he receives a new skateboard via this lady that he helps out, and he mounts a motor to the skateboard with a little remote control, and he just zips around the town on his motorized skateboard. But in the middle of the movie, the skateboard just starts talking, just like out of nowhere. Like he just wakes up, and it was funny because the skateboard was voiced by, you guessed it, Don DeLuise, the guy who did like The Secret of Nim, and it was just like, how did you get roped into this, Don? Like, where did things go? How tight were you, Don? Like, but no, just straight up in the middle of the movie, the skateboard just starts talking to the kid, and during that scene, Jontron pauses it and he goes, "What does a man do when the skateboard begins to speak? What does a man do then?" But anyways, that's just what that made me think of. Story time. All right. So probably the most, I don't know if it's the most common, but so then atheists could just deny premise 3. They would say that truth tracking mechanisms can still be deterministics. A deterministic example, the thermometer deterministically responds to temperature. Its operations are purely physical, yet it reliably tracks truth about the temperature. I would say that this response does not satisfy the normativity requirement. That does not tell me that I ought to believe anything, only that the belief still might be true. So if I take Andrew's temperature and it says 98.5, I'd be like, man, Andrew, you don't got a fever. Did the thermometer tell me that Andrew didn't have a fever? No.
No.
The thermometer just told me what Andrew's temperature was.
It just gives you
It
information.
doesn't, yeah, it just gives you information. It doesn't say that I should believe the thermometer.
Right, because like if what let's say you do that and then but I'm having all other symptoms of a fever. Like you feel my head, it's very warm. I'm shaking, but the house is not cold. I'm sweating. I can show all factors of a fever, but when you take my temperature, it doesn't read that I have a fever, but by rational understanding and evidence provided, it would be wise to consider the thermometer may not be calibrated correctly. And then you would need to get a different thermometer or recalibrate the one you have and try again, because you have all other rational factors are telling you, well, it still seems like you have a fever. So maybe I shouldn't just trust one time and one spot testing of your temperature, because all the thermometer knows to do is read something and output that information. It cannot give you a definitive statement.
Right. Yeah. And it doesn't the thermometer doesn't sit there and try and convince you of its temperature reading either. You're like, oh hey man, you feel his forehead? That feels like 98.5, you know? Like, oh, it doesn't appeal to my other senses. It doesn't appeal to any of my senses. The thermometer isn't doing anything. It's just got some electrical signals that read the temperature, and then they display the little gauge.
My cat
But
is okay, by the way. It took a nosedive on camera, but she did not want to be held for a second. So she's okay. She's okay.
Hello, Akbar. Anyways,
Yeah.
Yeah, the thermometer is not trying to convince me of anything. The thermometer doesn't care if I believe that his temperature is actually 98.5. His temperature could very well be 98.5, but the thermometer isn't convincing me of that. It's just showing me what it reads. So again, we're not saying that, let's say atheism is true and everything is determined. There are still true beliefs. But why I should believe them, there is none of that. There is no why. Because there is no why. And most atheists don't really care. I would say, well, I don't know about most. I think some atheists genuinely just do not care. And so they just don't talk about anything regarding this kind of stuff because they just don't think it matters. And fair on them. It's consistent. But again, to me, it's not objectively true. And so chances are, if you're engaging with a person on this, they believe that there's objective normativity, that you should believe something because it's true. Like if a person's trying to convince you of atheism, why would you be trying to convince me of anything if it's subjective or if it's not true or if it's even if it doesn't matter, you know? All right, reliabilism. This is a good one. I like this response because this is probably what you'll hear from atheists most often. So reliabilism states that you ought to believe something. Sorry. You ought to believe something due to reliable belief forming processes instead of objective normative facts. So, for example, this is a way of reframing normativity, right, to fit within a naturalistic system, but it does not get to the heart of the issue, in my opinion. So they would say that the ought. So, for example, like if I walk into 99 professor mathematicians' offices, and I say, Professor, I have this equation here. I know you've probably never encountered it before. 2 plus 2. Now, what would you say the answer to this conundrum would be? And the mathematician would look me square in the eyes and say, Sir, have you ever tried getting mental help? But then they would say, Sir, the answer to that question would be 4. All 99 of them would say that. So now I'm sitting there as the 100th person to be asked the 2 plus 2 question, and I'm thinking to myself, man, well, all these mathematicians think that 2 plus 2 is 4, and they're reliable. I mean, I guess they're mathematicians after all. Most mathematicians would say this, so I guess the answer is probably 4. And you should believe it because most people believe it. Well, this may backfire a little bit. So You'd say that most atheists will say that consensus is something that justifies a position, i.e., the human brain makeup was reliable enough to produce a consensus on a certain thing, and so that means that it's probably true. The brain, they usually point to science being widely agreed upon, right? Math, biology, even though biology is sometimes disagreed upon, but biology, astronomy, all these things, these are the sciences, the testable sciences. They would say, well, consensus provides for you a reason that you should believe in something. Um, the problem is that if belief forming processes are so reliable, well, why have the vast majority of people not come to the conclusion of atheism despite having access to the same evidence as everyone else? The same can be true for a number of things, including science, like evolution. So evolution is not unanimously agreed upon. Neither is abiogenesis or anybody's theory of the beginning of the universe or anything like that. These things are all disagreed upon, and heavily so. In fact, I would say that maybe not among, well, I think that among everyone, including university professors and all that, even though the statistic would be a little bit different, but I think that most university professors and all that, they would mostly reject atheism along with the average layperson. Um, and there are even quite a few scientists who would disagree with evolution. So is consensus, Andrew, is consensus a good measure of truth?
No.
No, consensus has never been a good measure of truth. Only approximately 1/32nd of the NFL fans are fans of the Packers, but we all know that the Packers are the best team in the NFL. So consensus in that instance is completely unreliable.
Consensus can say that Dallas is America's team. However, that doesn't mean they actually are America's team. At one point, my Denver Broncos were the most popular polling team in the country. But no one ever came together and thought we should change the title of America's team from the Cowboys to the Broncos.
That was just smart marketing, Andrew. They were never America's team. Um,
It was always the Packers.
It was always the Packers. Always. But I digress. You know what I'm saying? Like, consensus is never like I don't even think there's a single thing that consensus is a good measure for.
Right.
Because let's say history, right? History, it's not something that we can test or anything like that. So you have to say, well, most historians believe this, but there is something like there is an objective truth to it. Like either something did or didn't happen. So
right, history objectively happened. Right? Like if I ate a sandwich yesterday at 11:55 and that is now history because we're in the present, I can state objectively from my knowledge I ate a sandwich yesterday at 11:55. So the history does create objective truth. That's actually an interesting premise that I didn't think about. But yeah, when something happens and it becomes history, it now is cemented in history and it becomes objective truth. Now, again, the further away we get from something and the less you know, evidences we have that it actually happened, doesn't change if it happened. It changes how people understand it happened or how many people are aware that it happened. But objectively, it did happen. Now, again, that could be on the end of something that you really can't figure out because obviously Chase didn't know until I said this that I ate a sandwich at 11:55. But I'm stating that the action itself cements itself into history as an objective fact that it did happen, regardless of how people come to that knowledge. It did happen. So, in the same way, um, it, just because of scholarly consensus, if 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 50 scholars came together and parsed through the evidence and said, "Oh, I don't know. I actually think Andrew ate at 12:55, and what we have is actually a misrepresentation of the text or a mistranslation of documents. And so it wasn't 11:55, it was actually 12:55.
Mm,
A consensus of scholars would not change the actual event. And again, this is a harder issue because, let's say there are Holocaust deniers, right? There are people who flat out deny that the Holocaust ever happened. Just because they deny it, it doesn't matter if they convinced every historian that it didn't really happen. If it happened, it happened. Rewriting history doesn't change what actually happened. It
right.
changes people's understanding of what happened, but doesn't change what if the event itself actually happened.
Mm,
So again, you can deny something all you want, and you can have historians deny it. They're fallible human beings. They can fail and they can mess up and make mistakes. That doesn't change whether or not the event itself did happen.
right. Um, so yeah, that's something that would state that. Well, yes, and I don't even know that a person can say that people agree on the vast majority of things because, like, even uh, like if hot dogs are better with mustard or ketchup, or if like some of these things are subjective, but some of these other things, I guess there are plenty of things that we can all quote unquote agree on. But again, it doesn't make it true that we all agree on it. It just means we all agree
Or,
on it.
well, it's even, even if a society comes to a consensus on an issue, it's like when we talk about um, ancient Near Eastern religions, the society may have come to a consensus that it was okay to sacrifice an infant on a burning hand, and that it was societally acceptable because it was a means to an end, that they truly believed that sacrificing this infant would please a fertility god, and then the Baal and Asherah would get it on in heaven, and then that would send rain down to the earth to cultivate the crops. That's what
Mm,
the Canaanites believed, and there could be a consensus of that because of that belief. That doesn't make something objective. That doesn't mean it was objectively right for them to do what they did. It doesn't mean that, um, you know, in the same way, like, and I guess this is on the more subjective end of it, but like their temple practices in what, no, 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 it's not subjective because of, I forgot the other part I was going to say. In Babylonian history, um, every woman had to go through a ritual for one of their goddesses, which involved them going into the temple and kneeling down and waiting for a man to bring them a silver coin. And they would then leave the temple and engage in sexual intercourse. And then once that was fulfilled, then she had fulfilled her duty to the priestesses and to the goddess, and she could then get married after that. That was something that had to be done before she could be essentially fully a woman in their culture. Um, Not no one clip that in the idea that I don't think a woman is a woman without being married. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying in their culture, to be fully in, you get it. But that's essentially just institutionalized sexual assault and abuse. That's not right or okay just because the consensus view of all the people was this is how we do things because this pleases the goddess. That doesn't make it right. you you can have you can be skewed morally off of consensus. That's consensus could absolutely skew the majority. I'm sure the majority view in Nazi Germany was that the Jews were evil and should be exterminated. That doesn't mean that dehumanizing an entire group of people is right.
I don't even know if it was the consensus in Nazi Germany. There were plenty of Germans who didn't know what was going on, but
Hitler was very popular in the
no,
beginning.
Hitler was popular, but um, his, like the way that they went about all that stuff, I don't know that the German population was legitimately informed about some of those things. So I like to hold out hope that they weren't all just rooting over the bodies of dead people. But I mean, there were quite a few that were more than happy to have that happen. But again, I don't know. Anyways,
Yeah,
let us
but yeah,
continue.
you get my point.
Right. And then the last argument that the naturalists will oftentimes use is the argument that rationality can emerge from physical processes. So it would say that, well, truly rational thought is attainable through purely physical processes, i.e., that your brain develops the rational center, right, where all your rationality happens and all that stuff. And obviously, Andrew and I would deny that any of this is true or possible. Like the chances of humanity's evolution was already completely astronomically slim, and that's putting it lightly. And the universe creating itself from nothing also, like, to me there's no chance there, you know what I'm saying? Like, what do you mean there's a chance? Like, that doesn't know. um but let's say I grant this. Let's say that I grant that you can have rationality develop in your brain. That only serves to tell us that and how rationality happens in naturalism, not why logic has normative authority over a belief. So you feel what I'm saying, right? The burden of proof would be on the atheist to show that logical and normative relations are reducible to purely physical processes. You'd have to show how logic works physically, and that it works physically, and that it works in your brain physically, and that it's the same way for everyone, mind you, because you would say that everyone should believe a true thing. So, like, why? There's no should in atheism. Like, you can't really say that
Yeah.
anyone should anything in atheism. It is only what is. That's like,
So
some people they'll bring up the morality argument, and you'll say, well, the atheist will say, you see, it's been documented that there is a certain species of monkey. I don't remember what it was, but only some of them were given oranges, even though let's say there were five of them and only three of them were given oranges and the other two weren't given oranges. Well, these monkeys exhibited sharing, right? That's a form of morality, right? You should share. The problem is that, again, you're just telling me what is. You're just telling me that there are monkeys who share oranges. You're not telling me why I should do that. That's from normativity, the should. Like, why I should share my orange with Andrew when he didn't get one. Like, why?
right. I actually, as we were just talking, I thought of this argument. And so I am fleshing this out in real time. So if this ends up going off the rails, we'll just end up cutting it from the video. No one's gonna ever know. But but one thing about how can, in a naturalistic sense, if we're going off of the idea that the community determines what's right and wrong, then the opposing view would always be deviant, right? So let's say, how can we know slavery was wrong? Because this often gets used against Christians by people who say that the Bible condones slavery, which it does not actually. I know there are verses people use to try and justify this, but most of the verses they use are very much out of context, as well as not understanding what Israel's laws were and what they were governing and how it actually leads people away from slavery. And also, Israel was more of an indentured servitude society. You don't start to see chattel property slavery until Rome. However, sorry, not that they didn't exist before Rome, but that as far as the Bible is concerned in the New Testament, in the Roman period, you get chattel slavery more than indentured servitude. However, so the first as far as we know, one of the first abolitionists was Saint Gregory, who was the brother of Basil, and he argued that owning another human being was unacceptable and wrong because they were made in the image of God and that they deserved respect and honor as all humans do. They had basic human dignity. Gregory would have been considered deviant because the societal norm, not just in Rome, but across the world, was the understanding that humans could own other humans. In some form or fashion, you could have dominion over another human being, and that was considered by the consensus right and rational. So now you have this one person claiming, no, there is an objective truth beyond all of this, that human beings are made within the image of God and deserve respect and decency, and no one should own another human being. And listen, I believe and admit there were other Christians who told him he was wrong. Okay? That's not the argument. The argument is, how do you justify in a societal consensus view when the opposing view has to come from somewhere and has to not only exist, it has to convince people it's true, to then shift the societal understanding and the consensus view to flip and say, oh, slavery is bad. Because if the societal view for majority of human history was slavery is fine, or slavery is a necessary evil, or slavery is good or acceptable, then any opposing view in a societal consensus understanding is deviant, and you would argue is wrong, because it goes against the societal understanding. It goes against the majority understanding. It's wrong in a naturalist sense because it goes against the whole. If all we're talking is survival here, well, then the consensus view of the whole is where we find subjective truth. And right now, in this instance, this is true. And so when you present an opposing argument, if the whole group is against you, you're wrong. Because how in naturalism can you justify that his perspective actually was the true one? It was singled out and alone. He was the only one who thought that way. How can you justify that he had any form of truth or logic or rationality in his argument if the whole consensus argued against it? I would argue you can't. The idea can't develop because the majority, he's arguing from a perspective outside of the consensus view. He's arguing that there is a rational, objective truth that human beings deserve to be more than property. That would mean that there was a truth that was underlying the surface that had to be discovered because the consensus was not that. Well, how can that exist in a naturalistic understanding? How can objective truth exist in naturalism?
Yeah. And we're not trying to argue that objective truth wouldn't necessarily be a thing in naturalism. It's just, why would anyone care? And what
Right.
would be the point?
Because then people had to be convinced. People then were
Right.
convinced that slavery was wrong over time. It was you can't look at the history and convince me that the majority position was that slavery was always wrong. But it would no, the majority position was not that slavery was always wrong.
I don't even know if the majority position today is that slavery is wrong.
There are still, I think we actually have isn't it that we have like the most slaves today that ever? in
Yeah, I
history.
mean, there's also more people. I think per
Right.
capita there's less, but I think in terms of like the number of actual slaves, then I have no idea. I wouldn't be
Well,
surprised.
and then you come down to semantics about something may not be called slavery, but is it still slavery?
Right.
But yeah, that again, the fact that an individual can lead a resistance to then come up and convince the entire community that their position they've held on to for centuries is wrong and evil and should be abolished. How does that happen? If we're talking about we just go off of what is generally believed and fully conceived by the community and group and society, then how can anything ever change or progress by an individual asserting a statement? Because they're trying to fight for something that's outside of the communal sense. Anywho, I
Yeah,
sorry
that's
again, and
the no, that's
and
the
it,
last slide.
well, if somebody's gotten to this point in the video and they take a problem with anything I just said and they have an argument against it, again, I came to my mind, I fleshed it out just now. It is at the end of the video because it doesn't need to be in the middle of the video because this is a last thought. So somebody could absolutely poke a hole in what I've said. You're welcome to try that. It's just on my mind. It's something to ponder.
Mm.
But
All right. Well, that's all I had in my slide presentation. I I love this argument. I think it's a good argument. I think it works. Um, as I was determined to. So
and then you get using this argument, and then you get to natural conclusions. That if like Islam, for instance, is preaching a determined reality, well, then that's another way you can prove Islam to be false.
right.
Because if we can have rational thought that leads us to conclusions based upon evidence, then that means that determinism cannot be true. And that means
Mm,
that you know Allah did not determine me to believe something. I came to that belief,
right.
so I can reject Allah, right? And in the same way, um, I can reject premises given by deterministic Christians. Um, if by my rationality and my logical understanding and the evidence was provided and the scripture parsed through, I see that a determined reality creates a cold or distant God, or it violates the character of God
Mm,
presented in Scripture. I can go with that and understand that God could not have determined me to believe this way, but somebody else to believe differently. But He allowed us the ability to rationally look through the evidence and come to a conclusion, which breaks determinism. So,
right.
Chase, I think you've put together a very good presentation here.
Appreciate you. Yes. Anyways, feel free to use this argument. We're not charging this time around per use. We might though in the future. We might we might charge for Andrew's argument that he presented at the end. We're still not sure about that. Um, but the one that I presented, you can send all money to C.S. Lewis and have him playing again, all those guys. But but yeah, that's all I had. Feel free to let us know just how wrong we are in the comments.
Mm-hmm.
Please tell us
How big stupid
how
we are.
ignorant we are
Mm-hmm.
in the
That's
comments, and then
that's
tell us
okay.
why. And then really, you should convince God to determine us to believe what you think. So
Hmm. And yeah, so if you've made it this far in the video, go ahead and like it. If you hated it, like it anyways, because you know, just
you
cause.
love because where's
Or
your little thing?
oh yeah, or Redeemed Zoomer says dislike it twice. Um, yeah, yeah, like and subscribe. Go ahead.
Look,
Click the buttons. Subscribing and liking the video, sharing the video are the free, easy ways that you can help the channel grow. And yeah, and if you also made it this far, if there's something that you have been wanting an explanation on, or if there's a topic that you want discussed at detail, drop it in the comments and we will start studying up. But yeah, got anything else, Chase?
No, only to say that this video was determined, and that the number of likes and views that it gets is also determined, and our channel is determined. So
Absolutely, it was all predetermined.
Mm.
Well, guys, check us out on our Tuesday night live streams with Adam Seeker. I keep wanting to say Adam Stranger, Adam Seeker, where we discuss Islam at length. Check us out on Wednesday nights, 9 p.m. Central Standard Time, where we go through our apologetics curriculum. And check out our live streams on Thursday nights, not on our channel. We're actually partnering with Defending Alliance. We'll be on his channel. And that usually also is between 8 to 9 p.m. Central Standard Time. Check out those streams as well, typically about Islam, but they do also sometimes branch into other topics. And we will be having announcements soon for a new joint venture gaming channel called XP to Eternity. So be on the lookout for that. We are working on getting some stuff published for that channel. We had tried doing the Sons of Thunder gaming channel, but then we ended up connecting with a group of guys who all like to, all of Jesus and all like to play video games. And so we all decided to do a group channel together. And so that way we all are free to post independently and do group gaming. So that'll be a fun time. Check that out. We'll probably have a post on that soon on our page relative to when this video comes out. But all right. Well, see y'all next time.
Peace.